Hello, my viewers. Some of you might be a little bit confused about why I would claim that slave societies are civilized societies. Please let me explain. First, let us begin with the definition of a slave society, as a slave society is different from a society that merely allows slavery and has a few slaves within it. Instead, in a slave society, slaves aren't just a few slaves here and there, but slaves compose a significant portion, at least 10% of the total population and workforce, and is considered connected to the main or one of the main sources of income for that society. Thus, these are not societies with just a few slaves, but societies with mass slavery. And some examples of slave societies throughout history are the Akkadian and various Assyrian Mesopotamian empires and city-states, and many other early Middle Eastern entities, but not all Middle Eastern entities were slave societies. There's also many of the ancient Greek city-states that were slave societies. The early Roman Republic and early Roman Empire were slave societies with a large portion of the population under slavery. The early Arabic caliphates and then also the later Turkish Ottoman Empire were slave societies. The African Empire of Aksum and many later Ethiopic dynasties and empires were also slave societies. Then you have the various European empires and their use of slavery in the New World, and especially in Southern America and Central America, where the Spanish and Portuguese created huge slave plantations. What all of these various very different entities have in common is that they had structures to actually have mass slavery. They were civilized enough to have mass slavery. And now this talk about civilization and civilized makes it important to move into the definition of civilized that I will use here. It is not a set definition with a set criteria, but rather a relative definition that means more organized and structured with more formalized, stronger institutions than the average society in comparison to more decentralized and unformalized institutional structures that exist in other societies around this slave society. This is not a moral judgment, but a statement about formalized organizational power on a social scale. With those things said, some of the most important structures that a society must have in order to actually be able to have mass slavery are the structures to recognize property and the structures to enforce property claims over human beings. It is important to note here that slaves are living beings and pretty hard to control by yourself. And it becomes much harder the more slaves you have under you, and especially when there are very weak recognized ideas of property and systems of protecting your ownership of these slaves that want to get away from being forced to work under you, after all. Hence, you need a system that enforces your right to own these slaves, as an individual cannot enforce this right when the number of slaves reaches a certain number above controllability for a singular person. This is what really separates slavery with just a few individuals being enslaved and mass slavery, where large amounts of the total population are enslaved. In relation to this, you also need cultural and legal structures that recognize slavery as a legal right and justifies it in various ways and makes it acceptable to greater society through generations, as mass slavery more or less requires this generational acceptance of it to continue, and for slavery and slaves to be inherited, and for mass slavery to make sense as a long-term economical investment, as it would not make economical sense to invest in massive amounts of slaves if there is always a risk that slavery will be abolished soon. Thus, these structures that keep slavery as an institution throughout several generations are important for mass slavery. There are several structures that can be used in order to guarantee the intergenerational transferal of slavery as a concept. You can have religious justifications and structures for it, where slavery is seen as a divine right or due to some people having been cursed into being slaves for another people, for example. And these religious structures require the existence of a religious system and organization in order to maintain and spread this view. You can have historic cultural authoritative norms that are not religious but still justify slavery. For example, if a society views strength as the ultimate measure of right and then conquers weaker societies, then slavery makes sense as an institution. For example, you can see this with regards to the Spartans and the Helots, or the Romans and the various barbarian tribes that they conquered. And in combination to this, you can also have legal norms of separating, for example, various races or other subgroups in various hierarchies in society that in turn justifies slavery of them. And when you speak about legal norms, you also need a legal system and the structures that are formalized and advanced enough in order to maintain these legal norms, to ensure that the law continues to be followed through several generations. The short summary of this is that mass slavery requires complicated and advanced social structures in order to maintain it and pass it on, and to ensure that it's acceptable through several generations. Then you also have another practicable matter with regards to mass slavery and social structures, and that is that the structures that make large-scale plantation and organization of other massive work projects possible, where mass slavery makes sense from an economical, rational standpoint, also needs concepts of formalized property rights and obligations to function. In certain regards, slavery is actually quite expensive, and having massive amounts of slaves is even more expensive. Because with slaves, you still need to feed them and house them, even when they do not work. And they need to be under watch so that they don't escape or rebel in other ways, some which can be quite violent. And idle slaves are even more of a worry, as they have more time to plan escape attempts or rebellions. Because of these reasons, slavery only makes sense when you have a need for constant uninterrupted labor on large-scale projects, such as in mines or on plantations, and some other massive projects and undertakings. So mass slavery is dependent upon these large-scale projects that only make sense in a context where you have the potential to make large-scale profits out of them, as the costs are so high, and where the future security of these investments are ensured by various structures around them. Consequently, societies that can't keep order and security for investments do not have mass slavery. And you also need to have these structures of order and security in order to keep the slaves down when you have mass slavery. Often this means a central standing army, or at least forces that can quickly be called upon to squash rebellions when individual local powers fail to subdue these rebellions. Because locally they will sometimes be outnumbered, because when you have large amounts of slaves, you have large amounts of people that can turn into dangerous rebels. And you need to have a system to deal with it. This is say, a system to move armed forces from one region to another without much hassle, especially as slaves can be concentrated in certain regions, and thus overwhelm local forces much more easily there than elsewhere, creating a need to move forces in order to squash these rebellions. You can see this need for a strong centralized army in, for example, the crushing of the Spartacus rebellion in southern Italy during the time of the Roman Republic, or the crushing of the Zend rebellion in southern Iraq during the time of the Arabic Abbasid Caliphate. Here, a strong centralized force is necessary to keep local slave rebellions down, and you need cities and societies that are quite advanced in terms of recognizing formalized systems of control and central organization in order to create these formalized, centralized systems of armies and force that are needed. These reasons of organizatorial force are why you usually don't see mass slavery in, for example, nomadic tribal societies or among decentralized barbaric societies. These types of societies often require too many informal agreements and negotiations built upon personal relationships to efficiently and quickly structure society and raise forces that when the forces are raised, if they are at all, are too late and too brittle in organization and too impermanent of a coalition of forces to maintain the order required for mass slavery in terms of security and avoiding massive slave rebellions. Sure, these societies might still have slaves, but it's not until you get strong, societal, formalized institutions that can react quickly enough or maintain the order that mass slavery requires that it becomes possible or even desirable to practice mass slavery. This is also why we don't see mass slavery in Western European societies after the fall of the Western Roman Empire until stronger state structures were developed during the Renaissance and in parallel with the colonization of the New World of the Americas. The structures were simply not there to ensure the order that was needed until then, and by then they had also found a place where slavery was to be used and was desirable to use. In the Americas, on plantations, and in mines, such as the silver mines of Argentina. Speaking about barbarian and civilized societies. Due to civilized societies being better organized, civilized societies are often much stronger in projecting force, and this type of strength is needed to conquer and enslave other people. Sure, exceptions do exist of more decentralized and less formalized entities winning or actually conquering more advanced societies, but generally the trend is the opposite. As you have, for example, the Romans conquering barbarians in Gaul and Germania. You have the Axum Empire and later Ethiopic empires conquering surrounding less organized tribal groups and enslaving them. You have the early Arabic caliphates taking Turkish and Slavic slaves from the north of them or Africans from the south. And then we have the Europeans enslaving and colonizing after they had developed to become more organized. In order to take massive amounts of slaves and thus have mass slavery, you need to be a lot stronger than other societies in terms of organization, and this is why slave societies are ultimately needed to be civilized societies, more organized societies that can conquer other societies and also protect against other societies better, because you need the stability of peace within your borders in order to make massive work projects and thus through it mass slavery an economically rational choice. Now, before I finish, I would also like to point one thing out. Just because mass slavery requires a civilized society does not mean that every civilized society throughout history has practiced mass slavery or even slavery on a small scale in certain rare cases. For example, mass slavery never developed in the pre-Islamic Persian empires such as the Achaemenids and the Sassanids, and in much of Chinese history or in later Central and Northeastern European history, such as in Russia, other types of labor was preferred, such as serfdom or forced state labor, which are quite distinct from slavery, where you actually own people as property. Even if a society is civilized, the massive use of slavery, or not use of slavery, is also a result of geographical, cultural and historical reasons. Yet mass slavery requires a society to be a civilized society with advanced structures. And this is why slave societies are civilized societies. And I hope you have found this video informative and thought-provoking. As always, if you have any questions or other comments, please post them and give this video a like. Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.